Another important framework that I would like you to keep in mind when you approach conflict is the conflict management styles. We do differ in the way we perceive or trained or programmed through our cultural or societal or familial upbringing. How we perceive and value assertiveness on one side versus the cooperativeness. Some cultures are much more focused on the task, performance, and accomplishments, while other cultures may be significantly overvalue the cooperativeness and the community unity in among the members of the group. So it's very important to understand where your perception puts you in that framework and where do you think the person who you have in conflict situation may be fallen into. So important ones would be the avoiding. This is the approach, the mentality of lose-lose. I will lose, they will lose. There's no reason to go into conflict. Conflict is bad and there is nothing in it. So that's probably the most critical place of lose-lose approach. The other two, the accommodating and the competing side, they're kind of a little bit of extremes, but they all coming from the place that there is one party that will lose and one party that will win. In the accommodating style, you will find more winning, yielding to another party, to the person that you're dealing with. One in the competing place, it's a my way, highway type of approach, but either one of those is generally very igniting and overall do not lead to constructive way of resolving the situation. Probably one of the most dangerous beliefs that I often see when I work with coach my clients, I see the concept of a compromise, which is often perceived as a positive thing. But the compromise is when you have a little bit of a win and a little bit of a giving up something, and there is no clear satisfaction in this agreement ultimately because there is a feeling of some sort of resentment and unfinished business. Well, the most successful ways of approaching conflict would be the collaborating style, where both parties win, where there is a negotiation, when there is a strategic way to arrive into the solutions that I call we mentality, where we find the way, and both parties can grow through these alternative solutions that may be a third way of coming up with the decision that satisfies both parties. Another very important element in understanding conflict would be the communication styles. Roughly speaking, we can identify four of them that most commonly can be viewed. And they do fall into the concept of respect for yourself and respect for others. The first one that you probably will see very often is the passive one, which is showing a greater respect for others, but dismissing your own values often. And we see this in the people pleasing and the self-wellness sacrifice component. It's that serving others before yourself, dismissing your mind, your energy, feeling not important, feeling that your needs and values or interests are not valuable enough, that your time and energy can be staffed on, and there is a feeling overall that I lose, they win. The second very clearly identifiable piece is the aggressive behavior, which is very easy to see. Obviously, it's my way, highway, it's bullying behavior, but we often see this in the leadership approaches from the past, but kind of translating this into the present as well, and surprisingly in parenting styles. It's the conversation where I said so, I'm right, you're wrong, let me teach you. There's lots of teaching, lots of advising, and solicited advice often, and sometimes playing a very active and aggressive behavior. So it's a concept of I win, you lose. And passive aggressive, which is probably the most common style in many people that I can get to work with. It's kind of coming from the place of you don't want to comply, but you also want to avoid the conflict. So you kind of hesitantly agree to but then you expressing in some ways, whether it's through your body language or linguistically, language-wise, expressing some sort of dismissal to or disrespect to the process. And it's compliant but with hesitation. It's softly resenting and resisting something. And this shows up in the form of gossiping and sarcastic jokes, microaggressive comments, which really is a low respect to other people because you don't really want to do this, but it's also low respect for yourself. And finally, the most positive and probably the only positive way of addressing or in communication is really being in assertive mode when you have clear, respectful expression of what you want and what you need, which you really need to understand this first of all for yourself. Setting certain boundaries, and boundaries don't come naturally to anyone. It's a skill that comes with practice and practice and practice. And it's not just about saying no, but also being comfortable with receiving no, or at least being able to stay with the no of others and not take it personally and shift into one of those aggressive or passive behaviors. And a big deal of emotional intelligence, tolerating those uncomfortable emotions instead of trying to avoid them or kill them or shift them into positivity. And that's ultimately the place of the win-win mindset, the we approach to relationships. And finally, important is also to understand that conflicts do not just erupt out of nowhere. They're like volcanoes that kind of have the seismic activity that you can predict, you can measure, you can sense, you can feel. So it's important to understand that there's stages of conflict and notice that there is a latent conflict where it's kind of a brewing ground, the conflict of landscape, I call it sometimes. The trigger could be a particular situation, but it's usually not the place where the conflict is born. It's just the igniting moment. It's a little spark that brings the dry wood into the big fire. And so it's important to understand the triggers and important to manage them, but even more so important is to understand this latent conflict. Finally, when the conflict does arrive, it is not the place to start necessarily solving it. It's best to let it kind of burn out a little bit to serve the conflict wave during the acute conflict and then come back proactively to the resolution of the conflict when the emotions are a little bit less active and where there is an ability to have strategic approach to this conversation. And then finally, not doing this alone, getting the support, and really not trying to solve everything by yourself, because the hero journey, as fantastic as it might be, is really not the most productive way sometimes. So there are different strategies, there are different systems that could be supportive, anything from mediation and conflict resolution systems in the office to coaching and practicing in strategic approach to your difficult conversations outside of that. And it's really important to understand that there is a logic in this. You can sense the conflict, have some conflict management strategies, and then evaluate the outcome, and then apply different solutions next time until you find the one that really resolves the problem. You can also anticipate conflicts and have the time and place set, this pause, present, plan, pursue process to diagnose and define the conflict, find different lenses, see if there is a different way to reframe the conflict, and identify alternative solutions and move into the place of we and win-win mentality, as well as finding the language to communicate it to others. And to finish up this quick review of all the fantastic different frameworks that we discussed, again, in the context of remembering that loop of how the stress, thoughts, emotion, action, and reaction work together, and recognizing that there is this deep needs that we all have, whether it's you or the person you're dealing with. From that place, we can start thinking about constructive learning and growing through conflict. So first, an important thing to understand that many of us never got the role modeling for the successful conflict behavior. And it is essential to find someone who is successful in that, or work with a coach or a mentor for support strategy and practice, practice, practice. And also remembering the conflict perception formula. Threat minus safety equals danger, which will trigger the reaction. And from here, we go back into this loop of stress, thought, emotion, action, and reaction. So notice and recognize first and foremost when you're triggered. Listen to your body, recognize your stress response, and then feel what was this trigger. Knowing it will strategically help you prevent or eliminate future conflicts. The second thing we want to do is to recognize the facts and separate them from the story, from the meaning we assign to them. The fact that she was late 10 minutes does not necessarily mean that she was disrespectful to me. It just means that she was late 10 minutes. The disrespect is the meaning you assign to this. The third step would be to recognize your attitude. Think of this in three forms. Are you in the bucket of, okay, well, I'll show you? Or you're in the bucket of avoid conflict at all costs. Or you fall into the bucket of I'm curious, hey, let's discuss. There will be three very different attitudes that will initially shape and reframe your conflict in a very different way. What category of emotions do you feel are mostly prevalent when you think of this conflict situation? I ask you to think about at the beginning of this workshop. They will fall into the place of aggressive or avoidant or receptive and curious. When you're in an aggressive place, your reaction are going to be mostly coming from the place of irritation, right? It will be much more fight-flight type of reaction. The avoidance will likely feel more of a fear of being dismissed or rejected or disapproved, and guilt. That's the place that we're trying to avoid those uncomfortable emotions. And then receptive would be curiosity, would be interested to know more. The fifth stop would be the quick thinking, taking this to the context of a logic. What could be the intent that they had? No one is waking up every morning thinking how to make you miserable today. So it could have been the intent that they had was separate from the form in which it was delivered. And so maybe you didn't recognize or responded to the form, but the intent itself probably was in some positive way that we can think it that way. And then we want to understand if there are any needs or interests that may have been overstepped and perceived as threatened or endangered, because we remember this formula that threat minus safety equals danger, and it causes us to react. So if we start thinking from the place of intent, needs, and interest, we might start recognizing that there are some lenses that we can shift and start reframing the conflict situation just in the form of a disagreement. The sixth step would be to understand the mindset and kind of run into this question. Am I in a win-win place or am I in a lose-win situation? Where am I on the we versus I and you? Where is the contradiction versus cooperation, collaboration? And remember, in the culture differences and societal programs, men, women, older, younger people will have a significant place sometimes. So we need to also stop back and think, what if it's just the cultural perspective? Germans and French and Russians will be much more direct, while for the many Asian cultures, the direct response would be completely inappropriate and unacceptable. And very important is to recognize that no one is born great negotiators and conversationalists. We all have the skill that we can develop, and having difficult conversation has a strategy that you can learn, you can plan, and you can always practice and practice and practice until it becomes your second nature. Also important is to understand the language you use, even speaking to yourself about the conflict. It's these things about I'm stupid, he is aggressive, he is a bully, he's a narcissist. All of those conversations that we use in our language will charge us more or relax us into a different perspective. So what language could be used? The very general formula would be something to stay away from you language and stay with the I. Specific about very specific on the situation instead of you always do this, you never do this. The third element will be this focusing on specific behavior or words instead of the person. It's not like you're aggressive, but you said this, this, and that, and I felt it was disrespectful to me. Staying out of the identity threats of any kind, like you are the stupid one or you are the bully, and talking instead about your feelings. I felt angry when you did X. And then pausing and listening, which is absolutely important because we often never really stop talking. And if we do, we're not listening. We're preparing the next attack in our head and thinking how we're going to rebut them. So if we put it all together, the statement that you would like to start playing with will be sounding something like, I feel angry or I feel disrespected when you said this and that, as I interpret this as you don't care for my feelings. And then you pause and then you listen. They might explain things, they might come up with a different alternative that you don't even think about. And then you can continue with an alternative. I would appreciate if you could do this or this or this instead. And so this gives them an opportunity to not just feel stuck with the problem, but also see the potential of solutions that they may continue working on in the future.